there was no explosion, no alarm, no clear moment where things broke. Most people assume danger announces itself loudly, that real threats arrive with noise, urgency, chaos. But that's not how it usually starts. It starts quietly, so quietly that most people don't register it as a signal at all. At first, it feels like nothing is happening. Just a pause, a delay, a moment where things feel slightly off. You don't panic. You don't react, because nothing demands your attention yet. And that's exactly the problem. Human attention is trained to respond to motion, contrast, urgency. We notice what interrupts us. We ignore what blends in. Silence doesn't interrupt. It waits. In recent years, signals have changed form. They no longer arrive as obvious warnings. They appear as absence, as delays, as gaps where something should be. A message that never comes. A response that feels slower than it used to. A system that keeps working, but not quite as smoothly. Most people label this as normal. They assume it's temporary. They assume someone else is watching. They assume that if something were truly wrong, it would be obvious. History shows the opposite. The most important signals are often the least noticeable, not because they are small, but because they are quiet. Kite signals don't compete for attention. They don't shout. They don't flash. They require something modern life slowly removes. Stillness. Attention today is fragmented by design, pulled toward whatever moves fastest, reacts loudest, demands instantly. In that environment, subtle shifts disappear. Not because they're invisible, but because they don't fight for your focus. And when a signal doesn't fight, it gets filtered out. At first, you don't miss it. You adapt to its absence. You tell yourself things are mostly the same, that nothing fundamental has changed, that you're just tired, distracted, busy. That explanation feels safe, because noticing the signal would require a pause, and pausing feels uncomfortable. It forces comparison. It forces questions. It forces awareness. So the mind does what it's trained to do. It luges away. The signal remains unchanged, unacknowledged, not growing louder, not disappearing, just waiting. Once attention moves away, a pattern takes over, not consciously, not deliberately, automatically. The human mind is not designed to observe continuously. It's designed to conserve energy. Attention is expensive, so the brain learns to spend it only where there is friction, movement, contrast, urgency. Everything else is filtered out. This is not negligence. It's training. Every notification you respond to, every alert you acknowledge, every interruption you prioritize, they all reinforce the same rule. Only react when something demands it. Over time, this rule becomes internal. You stop scanning. You stop comparing. You stop noticing gradual change. Because gradual change doesn't demand reaction, it demands presence. And presence is rare. This is how attention slowly shifts from observation to response. You're no longer looking. You're waiting to be triggered. That's when signals start slipping through, not because they're hidden, but because they don't trigger the system you've built. A warning that doesn't escalate feels insignificant. A pattern that doesn't break feels safe. A delay that doesn't stop the system feels acceptable. So the mind it's probably fine. It's just noise. It'll correct itself. These explanations aren't random. They're protective. They reduce cognitive load. They restore a sense of stability. They allow attention to move on. And once attention moves on, something critical happens. The signal is no longer evaluated on its own terms. It's evaluated relative to expectation. As long as nothing dramatic contradicts the current model, the model stays intact. This is how blind spots form. Not suddenly, not obviously, but through repetition. Each time a quiet signal is ignored, the threshold for noticing the next one rises. What once felt unusual becomes normal. What once raised questions becomes background. until the absence itself stops being noticed. At that point, attention hasn't failed. It has adapted. Adaptation feels efficient. It feels calm. It feels safe, but it comes at a cost. Because adaptation doesn't distinguish between stability and stagnation, between silence and warning, between nothing happening and something being missed. The system keeps running. Life keeps moving, and the signal remains where it always was, outside the frame. This is where the war actually happens. Not in chaos, not in creases, not when everything is already broken. The real conflict happens much earlier. It happens in what you stop noticing. When attention adapts too well, it becomes selective, and when it becomes selective, it becomes predictable. Predictable attention is easy to manage, easy to guide, easy to overload. You don't need to hide signals from someone like that. You only need to make sure they never demand urgency, because urgency is the gatekeeper. If something doesn't feel urgent, it doesn't feel real. If it doesn't feel real, it doesn't receive attention. And if it doesn't receive attention, it might as well not exist. This is why silence is so effective. It doesn't provoke resistance. It doesn't trigger defense. It doesn't create friction. Silence blends in, and over time, that blending becomes dangerous. Because when attention is constantly trained to respond instead of observe, the ability to detect slow shifts disappears. You don't notice the gradual narrowing of options. You don't notice the shrinking margins. You don't notice the small adjustments becoming permanent. Nothing collapses. It just settles, and once it settles, questioning feels unnecessary, even uncomfortable. That's when the war is already being lost. Not because someone attacked, but because no one was watching. Most people believe attention is something they control, something they decide, but attention is shaped long before a conscious choice appears. It's trained by repetition, by environment, by what consistently rewards reaction over awareness. By the time you feel something is wrong, your attention has already been conditioned to look elsewhere. That's the cost. Not panic, not fear. Misalignment. A growing gap between what is happening and what you're able to notice. And the longer that gap exists, the harder it becomes to close, because recovering attention requires effort. It requires slowing down. It requires resisting the urge to react immediately. It requires noticing what doesn't move, what doesn't shout, what doesn't ask to be seen. This channel exists inside that gap. Not to warn you, not to alarm you, but to point out where attention quietly slips away. Before you leave, take a second to check if you're subscribed. Most people think they are. They usually aren't.